The castle walls trembled as another stone crashed against them, and Laura Parker pressed herself against the cold granite, her heart hammering as she clutched the small bundle of herbs that might be the difference between life and death for the wounded knight lying in the chamber above. The siege had lasted 3 days now, and Sir Raymond Martinez had taken an arrow to the shoulder while defending the eastern tower. Everyone said he would die. Everyone said the castle would fall. Everyone said she had been foolish to take the position that no other servant would accept, working for the most feared knight in the Northern Territories. But as she climbed the narrow stone steps, her worn boots silent on the ancient stones, Laura knew something the others did not. She had found something here in this harsh place that she had never expected to find again after her husband's death 6 months ago. She had found purpose. She had found respect. And perhaps, though she barely dared admit it to herself, she had found something that felt dangerously close to hope. The sound of splintering wood echoed from below as the enemy's battering ram found its mark against the main gate. Time was running out, and the man who had given her a chance when no one else would was depending on her now. Laura quickened her pace, knowing that everything that had led to this moment, all the small kindnesses and quiet conversations, all the ways this supposedly cruel knight had shown her that her life still had value, would be tested in the next few hours. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 2 months earlier, Laura had stood in the village square with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of recommendation from the parish priest. Her husband David's death had left her with debts she could not pay, and a landlord who showed no mercy to widows. The other women whispered behind their hands as she passed, some with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction of those who felt their own positions were more secure. She had tried the bakery, the inn, even the stables, but work was scarce, and her reputation as a woman alone made her suspect in their eyes. That was when old Dennis Jones, the castle's steward, had approached her with an offer that made the other villagers cross themselves and step away. Sir Raymond Martinez, the knight of Thornwick Castle, needed a servant. The position paid well, better than anything else available, but there was a reason it remained unfilled. The knight was known throughout the region as a man of few words and fierce temperament. He had returned from the wars in the East changed, scarred not just in body but in spirit. Servants fled his employment within days, claiming he was impossible to please, that his moods were unpredictable, that the castle itself was cursed with an atmosphere of perpetual winter. Laura had listened to these warnings with the desperate attention of a woman who had no other choices. The position included lodging in the castle, meals, and wages that would allow her to pay her debts and perhaps even save a small amount for the uncertain future. She accepted before Dennis could finish explaining all the reasons she should refuse. The journey to Thornwick Castle took half a day on foot, following a winding path through forests that grew thicker and darker as she climbed into the hills. The castle itself rose from the rocky outcropping like something carved from the mountain itself, its towers disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. The walls were thick and weathered, built for defense rather than beauty, and the narrow windows looked out over the approaches like watchful eyes. It was a fortress designed to withstand siege, and Laura felt her courage falter as she approached the massive wooden gates. Dennis met her at the entrance, his lined face kind but weary. He was a man who had served the castle for 30 years, who had watched 3 generations of knights come and go, and who carried the weight of keeping this place functioning despite its master's reputation. He led her through corridors lined with tapestries that had seen better days, past suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels, and upstairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Her quarters were in the servants' wing, a small but clean room with a narrow window that looked out over the courtyard. It was more privacy than she had known in months, and the simple furnishings felt luxurious after sleeping on floors and in doorways. Dennis explained her duties in his careful way, watching her face for signs that she might flee like the others. She would be responsible for the knight's chambers, his meals, the maintenance of his personal effects, and any other tasks he might require. She would report directly to him each morning and evening, and she would speak only when spoken to unless the matter was urgent. The first time she saw Sir Raymond Martinez, he was standing in the great hall examining a map spread across the massive oak table. He was taller than she had expected, with dark hair that showed silver at the temples, and a face that bore the kind of scars that spoke of serious battles survived. His left hand rested on the pommel of his sword, and there was a stillness about him that reminded Laura of a wolf pausing to scent the wind. When he looked up and saw her, his dark eyes held no warmth, but neither did they hold the cruelty she had been warned about. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress, her calloused hands, the way she held herself straight despite her obvious fear. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and measured, with no trace of the anger she had expected. He asked her name, her circumstances, whether she understood the requirements of the position. She answered honestly, meeting his gaze despite the way her heart raced, and something in her directness seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once and told Dennis to show her what needed to be done. The work was demanding but not unreasonable. Sir Raymond kept early hours, rising before dawn to train in the courtyard or ride the borders of his lands. He ate simple meals and cared little for luxury, preferring function over ornament in all things. His chambers were austere, containing only what was necessary, and he seemed to value efficiency and competence above all else. Laura found that if she anticipated his needs and performed her duties without fuss or chatter, he treated her with the same measured courtesy he showed Dennis and the few other long-term servants who had earned his respect. But there were moments, small glimpses, that revealed something deeper beneath his controlled exterior. She noticed how he paused sometimes while reading letters, his jaw tightening as if the words brought painful memories. She saw how he stood at his window in the evenings, looking out over the darkening landscape with an expression of profound solitude. She observed the care with which he maintained his weapons and armor, the way his hands moved over the familiar metal with something approaching tenderness, as if these tools of war were the only constants in a world that had taken much from him. The other servants gradually warmed to her presence. There was Kyle Mendoza, the young man who tended the horses and spoke of Sir Raymond with grudging admiration for his skill as a rider and his fair treatment of the animals. There was Nancy Harris, the cook, who had initially been suspicious of another woman in the castle but came to appreciate Laura's willingness to help in the kitchens during busy times. And there was Paul Anderson, the captain of the small guard force, who watched Laura with protective concern and seemed relieved that she showed no signs of fleeing like her predecessors. As the weeks passed, Laura began to understand why the previous servants had found the Sir Raymond so difficult. It was not cruelty that drove them away, but something far more challenging to endure. He was a man who had built walls around himself so high and so strong that reaching him required patience and persistence that few possessed. He spoke little, expressed even less, and seemed to expect those around him to function with minimal guidance or acknowledgement. For servants accustomed to clear direction and regular praise, his silence could feel like disapproval or indifference. But Laura had learned something about silence during the long nights after her husband's death. She had learned that sometimes words were inadequate, that sometimes the deepest communications happened without speech, and that a person's actions revealed far more about their character than their conversations ever could. She watched Sir Raymond, not with the fearful attention of someone waiting for punishment, but with the careful observation of someone trying to understand. She noticed that he never raised his voice to the servants, never made unreasonable demands, never punished mistakes that were clearly accidental. She saw how he ensured that everyone in the castle was properly fed and housed, how he paid fair wages and provided for the families of his men. She observed the way he listened when Paul Anderson brought concerns about the castle's defenses, how he considered Dennis's suggestions about improvements to the living quarters, how he made decisions based on the welfare of those under his protection, rather than his own comfort. Most telling of all, she began to recognize the signs of a man who was fighting battles that no one else could see, the way he sometimes paused mid-step as if struck by a sudden memory, the care with which he handled letters bearing certain seals, as if the parchment itself might wound him, the nights when she could hear him walking the corridors long after everyone else had retired, his footsteps echoing in the stone halls like the sound of a caged animal pacing its enclosure. It was during the 4th week of her employment that Laura made her first real mistake. She had been cleaning Sir Raymond's study when she accidentally knocked over an inkwell, spilling black liquid across a document that lay open on his desk. Her heart stopped as she realized what she had done. The parchment bore official seals and appeared to be some kind of legal correspondence. She stood frozen, cloth in hand, waiting for the explosion of anger that would surely end her employment. Sir Raymond entered the room as she was still staring at the ruined document, and she turned to face him with her chin raised, ready to accept whatever consequences her clumsiness had earned. She began to apologize, to explain what had happened, but he held up a hand to stop her words. He approached the desk, looked down at the damaged parchment, and for a moment his face was completely unreadable. Then he did something she had not expected. He picked up the document, examined it carefully, and told her it was nothing that could not be replaced. His voice held no anger, no frustration, only a kind of weary acceptance that suggested this was far from the worst thing that had happened to him. He asked if she was hurt, if any of the ink had splashed on her, and when she shook her head, he simply nodded and told her to clean up what she could. It was such a small thing, this moment of unexpected kindness, but it cracked something open inside Laura's chest that had been locked tight since her husband's death. She had grown so accustomed to walking carefully, to expecting the worst from every interaction, that this simple act of understanding felt like a gift she had not known she needed. From that day forward, something shifted in the dynamic between them. Sir Raymond began to speak to her more often, not in lengthy conversations but in brief exchanges that revealed glimpses of the man beneath the armor. He asked about her previous life, listened without judgment when she told him about her husband's illness and death, about the debts and the desperate search for work that had brought her to his door. In return, he shared small pieces of his own history, mentioning places he had traveled, battles he had fought, losses he had endured. She learned that he had once been married, that his wife had died of fever while he was away on campaign, that he had returned to find her buried and their home empty of everything that had given his life meaning. She learned that the wars in the East had taken not just his friends and his illusions about glory, but his faith in the idea that good intentions and noble causes were enough to protect the people he cared about. She learned that Thornwick Castle was both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could control his environment and keep others at a safe distance, but where he also lived with the constant reminder of his isolation. These conversations happened in fragments, scattered across days and weeks, like pieces of a puzzle that slowly revealed its pattern. They talked while she worked, while he reviewed correspondence, while they walked through the castle attending to various duties. The exchanges were never forced or overly intimate, but they created a foundation of understanding that made the silences between them comfortable, rather than tense. Laura found herself looking forward to these moments with an anticipation that surprised her. She had not realized how hungry she had been for genuine human connection, for the kind of conversation that acknowledged her as a person rather than simply a pair of hands to complete tasks. Sir Raymond listened to her observations about the castle, her suggestions for small improvements, her questions about the history of the place and the lands around it. He treated her opinions with respect, implemented changes when they made sense, and explained his reasoning when he disagreed with her ideas. The other servants noticed the change in atmosphere. Kyle mentioned that Sir Raymond seemed less brooding than usual, that he had even offered a few words of approval for the young man's work with a particularly difficult horse. Nancy observed that their master was eating better, showing more interest in his meals, and occasionally requesting specific dishes rather than simply accepting whatever was placed before him. Paul Anderson remarked that Sir Raymond's strategic planning seemed sharper, more focused, as if some burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Laura understood that she was witnessing something rare and precious. This man, who had been wounded by loss and betrayal, was slowly allowing himself to trust again. Not completely, not without caution, but enough to engage with the world around him rather than simply enduring it. She felt the weight of that trust and the responsibility that came with it. She had been given a chance to prove that not everyone would leave, that some people could be counted on to stay even when staying was difficult. The first real test of that trust came when a messenger arrived bearing news that bandits had been raiding the outer villages. These were not common thieves, but organized fighters, possibly deserters from various armies who had banded together under a leader of unusual cunning and cruelty. They had already struck 3 settlements, taking not just valuables but supplies, livestock, and in some cases people who could be sold or ransomed. Sir Raymond's response was immediate and decisive. He would take most of his men and ride out to track the bandits, leaving only a skeleton crew to defend the castle. It was a calculated risk, but one he felt necessary to protect the people under his care. Paul Anderson would remain as captain of the castle guard, and Dennis would oversee the day-to-day operations. But the reduced numbers meant that everyone would need to take on additional responsibilities. Laura watched the preparations with growing unease. She had seen Sir Raymond's dedication to protecting others, but she had also seen the shadows that crossed his face when he spoke of past battles. She understood that this was not just about stopping criminals, but about confronting the part of himself that had never fully returned from the wars. He was a man who carried guilt about the people he had failed to save, and she feared that this mission would either heal that wound or tear it open beyond repair. The night before his departure, she found him in the armory, methodically checking his weapons and equipment. The familiar ritual seemed to calm him, and she watched as his hands moved over sword and dagger, testing edges, examining straps and buckles with the thoroughness of someone whose life might depend on such details. When he noticed her presence, he did not send her away, but continued his work while she organized supplies nearby. They worked in companionable silence for a while before he spoke, his voice quiet in the stone chamber. He told her that he was leaving her in charge of his personal quarters and effects, that she should coordinate with Dennis on any matters that required his attention, and that she should not hesitate to make decisions if situations arose that could not wait for his return. It was a significant responsibility, one that acknowledged her competence and judgment in ways that went far beyond her official position. But there was something else in his manner, a careful distance that had not been there in recent weeks. Laura realized that he was protecting himself, pulling back emotionally in preparation for a mission that might not end well. She understood the impulse, had felt it herself when facing uncertain outcomes, but it saddened her to see him retreating into the isolation that had defined him for so long. She wanted to say something, to offer words of encouragement or concern, but she sensed that such gestures would not be welcome. Instead, she simply told him that everything would be maintained exactly as he preferred, that she would watch over the castle and its people with the same care he would show, and that she would be here when he returned. It was a promise and a statement of faith, delivered without drama or excessive emotion, and she saw something in his expression soften slightly at her words. The morning of departure was gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the castle walls. Sir Raymond and his men rode out in formation, their armor gleaming dully in the weak light, their horses' breath visible in the chill air. Laura watched from the battlements as they disappeared into the forest, and she felt a hollow sensation in her chest that she recognized as fear. Not just for his safety, though that was certainly part of it, but for the possibility that the man who had slowly begun to emerge from behind his walls might not survive whatever he was riding toward. The days that followed settled into a routine of watchful waiting. Dennis coordinated the castle's defenses and daily operations with his usual competence, but everyone felt the absence of their master's steady presence. Laura threw herself into her work with increased dedication, maintaining Sir Raymond's quarters with meticulous care, organizing his correspondence, and handling the small administrative tasks that normally required his attention. It was during this time that she truly began to understand the scope of Sir Raymond's responsibilities and the weight he carried. The letters that arrived daily spoke of disputes between neighbors, requests for judgment on matters of law and custom, appeals for assistance with everything from crop failures to family conflicts. She read them all, organized them by urgency and subject, and prepared summaries that would allow him to address each matter efficiently upon his return. But as the days stretched into a week, then 2 weeks, the nature of the correspondence began to change. Reports arrived of increased bandit activity, of raids that seemed to be growing bolder and more destructive. There were rumors that the group had been joined by other criminal bands, that they were no longer simply stealing, but actively terrorizing the population. Most troubling of all were the messages that suggested Sir Raymond and his men had been drawn into a running battle across difficult terrain, pursuing an enemy that seemed always one step ahead of capture. Laura found herself studying maps of the region, trying to understand the tactical situation and the challenges Sir Raymond might be facing. She consulted with Paul Anderson about the reports they were receiving, and she could see the concern in the older soldier's eyes. He knew better than most what it meant when a pursuit lasted this long, when an enemy proved this elusive. Either the bandits were far more skilled than expected, or they were being led into a trap. The possibility that Sir Raymond might not return began to weigh heavily on everyone in the castle. The servants went about their duties with subdued efficiency, and even Kyle's usual cheerfulness was dimmed by worry. Nancy prepared meals mechanically, setting aside portions that would not be eaten, maintaining habits that felt increasingly hollow. Dennis aged visibly under the strain of command, checking and rechecking the castle's defenses, sending out scouts who returned with no useful information. It was Laura who suggested they begin preparing for the possibility of siege. If the bandits had indeed grown in numbers and organization, if they had somehow eliminated or captured Sir Raymond and his men, then Thornwick Castle might become their next target. The suggestion was met with initial resistance, as if speaking the fear aloud might make it real. But practical necessity soon overcame superstition. They inventoried supplies, reinforced weak points in the walls, and established plans for defending the castle with their reduced numbers. Laura found herself taking on a leadership role that surprised everyone, including herself. Her months of observing Sir Raymond's methods, of understanding how he balanced competing needs and made difficult decisions, had taught her lessons she had not realized she was learning. But even as she helped coordinate these preparations, she held on to hope that they would prove unnecessary. She maintained Sir Raymond's quarters exactly as he had left them, kept his correspondence organized and current, and preserved the routines that would allow him to resume his responsibilities seamlessly upon his return. It was an act of faith that sustained her through the darkest moments of doubt. The breakthrough came on a morning when the fog hung thick around the castle walls. A lone rider approached the gates, barely staying in his saddle, his horse lathered with sweat and exhaustion. It was one of Sir Raymond's men, a young soldier named David Kim, who had ridden through the night to bring word of their situation. The news was both better and worse than they had feared. Sir Raymond and most of his men were alive, but they were trapped in an abandoned fortress 2 days' ride to the north. The bandits had indeed been leading them into a trap, using the pursuit to draw them away from populated areas and into terrain that favored the defenders. The criminals had revealed themselves to be not just thieves, but a well-organized military force, possibly funded and equipped by enemies of the realm who saw opportunity in the chaos of the post-war period. David Kim's report painted a picture of desperate circumstances. Sir Raymond's force was outnumbered 3-1 and surrounded by enemies who had prepared their position carefully. They had food and water for perhaps another week, but their ammunition was running low and several men were wounded. The bandits seemed content to wait them out, knowing that time was on their side. Any attempt to break out would result in heavy casualties, possibly the destruction of the entire force. But there was a possibility, a narrow chance that required precise timing and considerable risk. The bandits had grown confident in their siege, establishing a routine that left certain approaches less heavily guarded at specific times. If a small force could create a distraction at the right moment, Sir Raymond and his men might be able to fight their way out. The problem was that such a distraction would require someone to approach the enemy position, someone who could move undetected and strike at exactly the right time. Paul Anderson immediately began planning a rescue mission, but the numbers were daunting. Even taking every available man from the castle's guard would provide only a fraction of the force needed to challenge the bandits directly. They needed a different approach, something that relied on stealth and surprise rather than overwhelming strength. It was Laura who proposed the solution that changed everything. She had been studying the maps and listening to David Kim's detailed description of the terrain and enemy positions. There was an old smuggler's path that approached the fortress from the east, a route so narrow and treacherous that it would be impossible for a large force to use but might allow a small group to get close undetected. If they could position archers along this path and coordinate their attack with Sir Raymond's breakout attempt, they might be able to create enough confusion to tip the balance. The plan was dangerous and relied on perfect timing, but it was their best chance. Paul Anderson would lead the rescue force, taking every man who could be spared from the castle's defense. Laura would remain behind to coordinate communications and maintain the castle's security. It was a reasonable division of responsibilities, and everyone accepted it without question, except Laura herself. As she watched the preparations, as she saw the grim determination on the faces of men who knew they might not return, she realized that she could not remain safely behind while Sir Raymond faced destruction. Not because she was required to help, not because it was her duty as a servant, but because somewhere in the past months she had discovered that his life had become precious to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The decision formed slowly, crystallizing as she worked through the night to prepare supplies and coordinate the rescue mission. She had skills that might prove useful, knowledge of herbs and healing that could help wounded men, and a determination that matched anyone's in the castle. More than that, she had something to prove to herself, a need to demonstrate that she was not the helpless victim of circumstance she had been when she first arrived at Thornwick. When she announced her intention to accompany the rescue force, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Paul Anderson flatly refused to consider it. Dennis expressed horror at the idea, and even Kyle seemed shocked that she would suggest such a thing. They pointed out the dangers, the physical demands, the impossibility of a woman keeping up with armed men and men moving at speed through difficult terrain. But Laura had anticipated these objections and prepared her arguments carefully. She reminded them that she knew more about treating wounds than anyone else available, that her smaller size might be an advantage when moving through the narrow smuggler's path, and that an extra pair of hands could make the difference between success and failure. Most importantly, she pointed out that Sir Raymond had trusted her with significant responsibilities, had relied on her judgment and competence, and would expect her to do whatever was necessary to help save his men. The debate continued through the morning, but time was running short and practical considerations eventually overcame protective instincts. Laura's knowledge of healing could indeed prove valuable, and her determination was clearly unshakable. Paul Anderson finally agreed to let her come, but only if she followed orders without question and accepted that her safety could not be their primary concern during the mission. The rescue party departed at noon, moving fast along forest paths that Laura had never seen before. The pace was punishing, designed to cover the maximum distance while daylight remained, and she soon understood why the men had been reluctant to bring her. Her legs burned with effort, her lungs struggled to process the thin mountain air, and her pack seemed to grow heavier with every mile. But she kept up, drawing on reserves of strength and stubbornness that surprised even her. When they paused to rest, she tended to minor injuries and shared her supplies without complaint. When the path became treacherous, she accepted help when offered, but never asked for special consideration. Gradually, she earned the respect of men who had initially seen her as a liability. They reached the vicinity of the besieged fortress as darkness fell, and the sight that greeted them confirmed David Kim's dire report. The ancient stronghold sat atop a rocky hill, its walls scarred but intact, surrounded by enemy campfires that stretched in a rough circle around the base. The bandits had indeed grown into a small army, and their confidence was evident in the casual way they maintained their siege. They had time on their side and saw no need for haste. Paul Anderson studied the enemy positions through the darkness, confirming the details of the plan they had developed during the journey. The smuggler's path approached from the east, winding through a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide cover for archers. If they could position themselves correctly and coordinate their attack with Sir Raymond's breakout, they might create enough confusion to allow the trapped men to fight their way to safety. The most dangerous part of the plan fell to Laura. Someone needed to get close enough to the fortress to signal Sir Raymond about the timing of the rescue attempt. The approach required crawling through enemy-held territory, avoiding sentries, and somehow communicating with the besieged force without alerting the bandits. It was a task that required stealth, courage, and the kind of desperate determination that came from having everything to lose. Laura volunteered before anyone else could speak. Her smaller size and dark clothing would help her avoid detection, and her knowledge of Sir Raymond's habits might allow her to find a way to reach him. The men tried to dissuade her, but she had already made up her mind. This was why she had come, why she had insisted on joining the rescue mission, despite all the logical reasons to stay behind. The approach began in the darkest hour before dawn, when the enemy sentries were most likely to be tired and inattentive. Laura moved like a shadow through the rocky terrain, using every scrap of cover, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of discovery. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away, but she forced herself to move with patience and precision. The fortress walls loomed above her as she reached the base of the hill, and she could see the dim glow of fires from within the courtyard. Somewhere behind those ancient stones, Sir Raymond and his men were waiting for rescue or death, unaware that help was so close. She needed to find a way to communicate with them, to coordinate the timing that would determine whether the rescue succeeded or failed catastrophically. The solution came from an unexpected source. As Laura crept along the base of the fortress wall, she heard a familiar sound that made her heart leap with hope. It was the low whistle that Sir Raymond used to call his horse, a distinctive pattern that she had heard countless times in the castle courtyard. He was signaling to his men, probably coordinating some aspect of their defense, and the sound gave her a reference point for his location. She positioned herself beneath what appeared to be a narrow window in the fortress wall and began to whistle in response, using a simple melody that she and Sir Raymond had discussed during one of their conversations about communication signals. It was a long shot, but if he heard and recognized the tune, he might understand that rescue was imminent. The response came after several tense minutes. The same melody, whistled softly from somewhere above her position, followed by a pause and then a repetition. He had heard her, recognized the signal, and was acknowledging the communication. Now came the most difficult part, conveying the timing and nature of the rescue attempt using only simple sounds that would not alert the enemy. Laura used a combination of whistles and soft tapping on the stone wall to communicate the basic plan. 3 short whistles meant the rescue force was in position. A pause followed by 2 long whistles indicated that the attack would begin in approximately 1 hour. Sir Raymond's response, a complex pattern of taps on the wall above, suggested that he understood and would be ready to coordinate his breakout with the external assault. With the communication established, Laura began the dangerous journey back to rejoin Paul Anderson and the rescue force. The return trip was even more treacherous than the approach, as the sky was beginning to lighten and enemy sentries were becoming more alert. She moved with desperate care, knowing that discovery now would doom not only herself but the entire rescue mission. She reached the rendezvous point just as Paul Anderson was beginning to worry about her absence. Her report of successful communication with Sir Raymond galvanized the rescue force, and they moved quickly to their assigned positions along the smuggler's path. The archers took cover among the rocks, each man responsible for specific targets that would maximize the confusion and disruption of the enemy force. The attack began precisely at the agreed time, with flights of arrows striking the bandit camps from unexpected directions. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Men who had been confident in their security suddenly found themselves under assault from multiple positions, unable to determine the size or location of the attacking force. Shouts of alarm and confusion echoed across the hillside as the bandits scrambled to respond to this unexpected threat. From within the fortress came the sound of Sir Raymond's breakout attempt. The gates burst open and his men charged out in disciplined formation, striking at the enemy positions closest to their escape route. The coordination was perfect, catching the bandits between 2 forces and preventing them from mounting an effective response to either threat. But the plan was only the beginning. The success of the rescue would depend on the fighting ability and determination of men who had been under siege for weeks, facing an enemy that still outnumbered them significantly. Laura watched from her position among the rocks as the battle unfolded, her heart in her throat as she tried to track Sir Raymond's movements through the chaos. The fighting was fierce and desperate, with both sides understanding that everything depended on the next few minutes. The bandits had the advantage of numbers, but they had been caught off guard and were struggling to coordinate their response. Sir Raymond's men had the advantage of desperation and superior training, but they were exhausted and some were wounded. The tide of battle turned when Paul Anderson led a charge that broke through the enemy line at a crucial moment, creating a corridor that allowed Sir Raymond's force to link up with the rescue party. The combined groups fought their way toward the forest, using their knowledge of the terrain to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. The bandits pursued Aoyin, but their organization had been shattered by the surprise attack, and they could not mount an effective chase. Laura found herself in the middle of the retreat, helping wounded men and trying to keep up with the pace of the withdrawal. She saw Sir Raymond for the first time in weeks, his face grim with exhaustion and marked by new scars. but his eyes bright with the fierce joy of a man who had not expected to see another sunrise. When their eyes met across the chaos of the retreat, something passed between them that needed no words. The escape was successful, but barely. They reached the safety of the deep forest as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind an enemy force that was too disorganized to follow effectively. The cost had been significant, with several men wounded and supplies lost. But they had achieved what had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The journey back to Thornwick Castle was a mixture of exhaustion and elation. The rescued men were weak from their ordeal, but grateful beyond words for their deliverance. Sir Raymond moved among them constantly, checking on the wounded, coordinating the march, and ensuring that no one was left behind. But Laura noticed that his eyes sought her out repeatedly, as if he needed to confirm that she was real and not some desperate hallucination born of siege and desperation. They made camp that night in a defensible position, and it was then that Sir Raymond finally approached Laura directly. He found her tending to a wounded soldier, cleaning and bandaging a sword cut with the competent movements of someone who had learned healing from necessity rather than formal training. He watched her work for several minutes before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried emotions that he rarely allowed others to see. He thanked her for her courage, for the risk she had taken to help coordinate the rescue, and for her skill in treating the wounded men. But there was something deeper in his words, a recognition that went beyond gratitude for services rendered. He told her that her presence during the retreat had given him strength, that knowing she was there had somehow made the impossible seem achievable. Laura looked up at him as he spoke, seeing past the armor and the reputation to the man beneath. She saw someone who had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about his survival for reasons that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. She saw someone who had been wounded by loss and betrayal, but was slowly learning to trust again, to believe that not everyone would leave when staying became difficult. Her response was simple and direct, delivered in the same quiet tone that had characterized their conversations over the past months. She told him that she had not come on the rescue mission out of duty or obligation, but because his life had become important to her in ways that went beyond their professional relationship. She told him that she had found something at Thornwick Castle that she had not expected to find again after her husband's death, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of being valued for who she was rather than simply what she could provide. The conversation continued in fragments as they made their way back to the castle over the following days. They spoke of the future, of the changes that would need to be made to defend against future threats, of the ways that their relationship had evolved beyond the simple arrangement of master and servant. They talked about loss and recovery, about the courage required to risk caring about someone again, about the difference between existing and truly living. When they finally reached Thornwick Castle, the entire household turned out to welcome them home. Dennis wept openly at the sight of his master's safe return. Nancy immediately began preparing a feast to celebrate the occasion, and Kyle could barely contain his excitement as he listened to tales of the rescue mission. But it was Laura who felt the deepest sense of homecoming, the recognition that she had found not just employment, but a place where she truly belonged. In the days that followed, as the castle settled back into its normal routines, the relationship between Laura and Sir Raymond continued to evolve. The formal boundaries of master and servant remained in place, but they were overlaid now with something deeper and more complex. They had seen each other tested by extreme circumstances and had found that their trust and respect could survive even the most dangerous challenges. Sir Raymond began to rely on Laura's counsel in matters that went well beyond her official duties. He valued her insights into the management of the household, her observations about the needs and concerns of the other servants, and her practical suggestions for improving the castle's defenses and operations. She became, in effect, his partner in the administration of his lands and responsibilities. For Laura, the transformation was even more profound. She had arrived at Thornwick Castle as a desperate widow with no options and no hope for the future. She had found work that paid her debts and provided security, but more importantly, she had found a purpose that gave meaning to her days and dignity to her circumstances. She had discovered that she possessed strengths and capabilities that she had never been called upon to use, and she had learned that her life could still hold value and possibility even after devastating loss. The other servants noticed the change in both of them. Sir Raymond was more approachable than he had been in years, more willing to engage in conversation, and more responsive to the needs of those around him. Laura had grown in confidence and authority, carrying herself with the assurance of someone who knew her worth and her place in the world. Together, they had created an atmosphere in the castle that was more welcoming and hopeful than anyone could remember. The bandits were eventually tracked down and defeated by a combined force of knights from several neighboring territories, but the threat they had posed served as a catalyst for important changes. Sir Raymond began working more closely with his neighbors to coordinate defenses and share intelligence about potential threats. He also initiated improvements to the castle's fortifications and established better communication networks with the outlying villages. Through all of these changes, Laura remained at the center of Sir Raymond's world, not as a romantic partner, but as something equally valuable, a trusted companion who understood him completely and shared his commitment to protecting and nurturing the community they had built together. They had both learned that love could take many forms, that partnership could exist without passion, and that the deepest connections were often forged through shared purpose and mutual respect rather than romantic attraction. As winter approached and the castle prepared for the quiet months ahead, Laura often found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this place. She had taken a job that everyone else refused, working for a man with a fearsome reputation in a castle that seemed cold and unwelcoming. She had expected nothing more than wages and shelter, a temporary respite from desperation, while she figured out what to do with the rest of her life. Instead, she had found the best days of her life, not because they were easy or comfortable, but because they were meaningful. She had found work that challenged her abilities, a community that valued her contributions, and a relationship that enriched her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She had learned that sometimes the most rewarding opportunities were disguised as the most difficult choices, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The castle stood strong against the winter winds, its walls protecting not just the people within, but the bonds of trust and loyalty that had been forged through trial and hardship. Laura Parker, the widow who had arrived with nothing but determination and hope, had become an integral part of something larger than herself. She had found her place in the world, and in doing so had helped Sir Raymond Martinez find his way back to the land of the living. In the end, they had both discovered that the harshest places could sometimes offer the greatest rewards, and that the most unlikely partnerships could become the foundation for extraordinary transformations. The job that everyone refused had become the opportunity that changed everything, proving that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the most daunting challenges.